The success of any community is dependent upon the willingness of its residents to respect the law. But what happens when it's the officers of the court who create the problem? I'm Kathy with a K.
And I'm Kathy with a C.
And this is Killer Destinations.
Today's destination is Manalapan, Florida. The town of Manalapan is a truly unique municipality of unparalleled beauty and quality of life. Located in Hypoluxo, part of the Palm Beach Barrier Islands chain, it has a population of just over 400 residents. Manalapan was incorporated in 1931 by Commodore Harold Vanderbilt, and it's thought to be named after the New Jersey township of Manalapan, the Indian name meaning good bread. Just 175 yards off the coast lies the Loftus, a 220-foot Norwegian merchant ship that sank in 1898. Resting in just 15 to 20 feet of water, it is part of the Florida Underwater Archaeological Preserve and is a popular shallow water snorkeling spot. But in 1955, the residents of Manalapan focused their attention on the ocean, but not for purposes of recreation. Instead, it was a crime scene.
So before we start, we just wanted to dedicate this episode to Kim with Coleman Perkins Law Group. She is one of our listeners, and she let us know that she really likes historical stories. So the one that we're bringing you today, as you heard in today's destination, is from 1955. So Kathy, in mid-June of 1955, residents of Manalapan pretty much awoke to a perfect Florida day. It was mid-70s in the morning. Wasn't supposed to be too hot during the day. I'm guessing the humidity was way more than I personally would have handled, but if you're a Floridian, I think you're probably okay with it. But for one family, that was the only good part of the day. And that morning at about 8:30, a woman named Edna Trepp received a phone call from a contractor named Frank Ebersole who was looking for her boss. And Kath, this kind of surprised Edna because she was looking for her boss too. Now, Edna happened to be the secretary for Palm Beach County Circuit Court Judge Curtis Chillingworth. And Edna had worked for him for a while, and she knew the only thing that the judge was a stickler for, other than adhering to the letter and spirit of the law, was punctuality. And that morning, not only had he not shown up for work, but he actually also hadn't called her. And Edna could not think of another time when this had happened. He had a hearing scheduled at 9 o'clock that morning, and he was always there on time to prepare. So contractor Frank then told her that the judge had called him the day before and asked him to come over to fix a broken window. Frank and the judge had actually become friends, Kath, when Frank was hired to build the Chillingworth Beach House in Manalapan. So, we had talked about in today's destination how Manalapan is a beautiful, serene, wonderful place to live. And it is. And today it's actually a very, very, very expensive place to live. But back in 1955, the Chillingworths didn't have a mansion like most of their neighbors. They actually had just wanted a beach house. It was 10 miles from where they lived in West Palm Beach, and they just wanted a place they could relax. It was tranquil, kind of like a family getaway. So Frank went over that morning to the beach house to fix the broken window, but when he knocked on the door, nobody answered. So I'm thinking it's a 1955 thing, but Frank tried the knob, and when it opened, he walked on into the house.
Frank was like, "You absolutely want me inside your house."
Exactly. I don't know what you're doing, but you want me here too.
Right.
But he opened the door. He called out to Curtis Chillingworth and his wife, Marjorie. But when they didn't answer, he kept checking the house. And Kathy was going from the living room to the dining room to the bedrooms to the bathrooms. And he noticed that the beds appeared to have been slept in, but they weren't made. He realized that both their cars were still in the garage with their keys in them. And then in the living room, he saw something a little odd. It was a roll of adhesive tape that had been used up. But then as he walked out onto the back porch, he noticed a broken floodlight in their backyard. And as he's sharing this with Judge Chillingworth's secretary, Edna, with everything he's saying, she's becoming more and more alarmed. So she hung up the phone with the contractor and called the sheriff. And they said they would send some deputies out to the Chillingworth house.
The Chillingworth family was really known in the community. They first came to Florida from New York in 1892. And Curtis Chillingworth's grandfather was actually the first sheriff of Dade County. Now, this was in late 1800s, early 1900s, and he later served as the mayor of West Palm Beach. And Curtis's father, Charles, became an attorney in Florida, and then Curtis followed in his father's footsteps. So Judge Curtis Chillingworth was the first in his family to have been born in Florida. Now, this was 1896. And at the time, as you can imagine, West Palm Beach was very small, and he was only one of 7 students in his high school graduating class. So Curtis, as we said, followed in his father's footsteps. He became a lawyer at the age of 21, and he joined his father's law firm. And shortly after joining the firm, he enlisted in the Navy Reserve at the beginning of World War I and wound up serving a year and a half overseas. So after that, he returned to Florida. He resumed his legal career, and his trajectory was quite successful. When he was 24 years old, he married his wife, Marjorie, and they had 3 daughters. And again, he practiced law with his father for many years.
And Kathy, it's interesting. He actually dipped out of this practice for a couple of years in the mid-40s because at the age of 48, he was drafted into World War II, which I thought was odd.
That was very odd.
Well, yeah, he was so much older, but it turns out, and it didn't say exactly what he was doing, but basically he didn't spend time on any ships. He was actually sent to England to help with the preparation of plans to invade Germany.
That's so crazy.
I think that had to have been why he wasn't being, pulled into the regular Navy unit. It was more like, we need your specialized brain and talents.
Exactly. So 2 years after he finished his invasion of Germany.
Just the planning.
Just the planning.
He was a lover, not a fighter.
He was elected to circuit court judge, and that was a position he held for 32 years until his disappearance in mid-June of 1955.
So, Kath, back to the investigation. We're at the Chillingworth Beach House in Manalapan. And as we had said, a couple deputies were sent out there to try and figure out where the Chillingworths might have gone. And when they arrived, they spoke to the contractor and discovered everything that the contractor had said: the broken floodlight, the bed slept in but not made. But as they looked further, Kath, they realized that something much more nefarious might have happened than they originally thought. And so they called back to the sheriff and said, hey, in addition to what the contractor said, there's blood that we found in the backyard along the trail to the beach, and nothing had been stolen from the house. So if somebody had broken in to steal or do something like that, they'd done a really bad job because money was left in the wallet and purse and no jewelry had been taken. So Sheriff Kirk immediately contacted numerous police forces from around South Florida, and they all came to assist. Within a short time, and we're talking just a matter of hours, more than 100 law enforcement officers were swarming the Chillingworth's home and property. And when have you ever seen 100 police officers together other than when they raid your house every now and then?
Yeah, besides that, never.
Yeah.
Never.
That's a huge number.
That's a ton.
Adrian's Kickback.
Oh, Adrian's Kickback in Huntington Beach.
Yes.
That's right.
Actually, I don't even know if there were 100, but I hope there were.
Trust me when I tell you there were. It's hard to count them when they're swinging batons. You know what I mean? We've talked about Adrian's Kickback before, but
have we?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure we have. But if you guys haven't heard about Adrian's Kickback, Google it. It's insane. Okay, back to the story.
Okay, we're back.
Where are you?
So we're talking about all the 100 police officers had been called in. Adrian was not on their property, so there wasn't a reason for it to happen. And by now, the news had spread around town. So not only do you have all the police officers, you have the press there, you have looky-loos who just have heard about it and want to, poke their heads out their car and figure out what's going on. And they had neighbors who were like, maybe I need to go get that cup of sugar back that I loaned to them, see what's going on in the house.
So as a consequence, the crime scene, I'm calling it a crime scene in quotes at this point, was completely trampled all over.
Absolutely it was. And not only that, but the barrier island was so small, I'm wondering if it started tipping with all those people on it. So in talking to the neighbors and to the daughters, deputies learned that the night before they disappeared, 58-year-old Judge Chillingworth and his 56-year-old wife Marjorie had dinner at the home of Palm Beach County Tax Assessor James Owen. And Kath, at dinner, apparently the big topic of conversation was an upcoming cruise around the world that they were planning to take, and how much the Chillingworths were looking forward to the arrival of their 3 daughters who were supposed to come into town for a few days. And Kath, one of the things the daughters said was that this beach house was imagined by her father to be the family get-together place. Once a year, if no other time they were able to get together, they would get together at the beach. So he would plan these vacations out like a year in advance to make sure everybody had time, the husbands had time off work, the kids weren't busy with doing other things. And that was 2 days from when they disappeared, which was even stranger to the daughters because they were so excited about being there.
Right. Why would they leave?
Right. But Kathy, after everyone trampled and toddled all over the Chillingworth house, the crime scene was a hot mess. And really, sheriff's deputies and any other law enforcement officer there figured out that, at the very least, the Chillingworths had been abducted. Okay, so as we get more into this podcast, some of the background details were different depending on what you read. As we found with older newspapers, that tends to happen. So some of the details that we got were from a 2019 podcast called Chillingworth. And Kath, you'll like this. The two guys who did this podcast were John and Jonathan.
Maybe they want to be friends with Kathy and Kathy.
Or Kathy and Catherine.
I'll do Catherine.
I can do Catherine too.
Which one do you want?
Kathy and Kathy.
No, I'm talking about the men.
Well, I'd have to see them to be able to assess their looks and potential wealth. But anyway, so what was interesting about this podcast, Kath, and it's actually, I usually, as you know, don't listen to podcasts before we do this because it just kind of muddies everything. But the reason they did their podcast, and it was done back in 2019, it was 12 episodes, I believe. They did it because they had grown up hearing stories about the Chillingworths at their dinner table. It turned out that their grandparents were friends with Curtis and Marjorie Chillingworth, and their parents had grown up with the three Chillingworth daughters. So they had heard about it over and over again through the decades.
That is so cool.
Right. And so they were interested in it. And thankfully, they had a few contacts just because of how they knew everybody and all of that. So they were actually able to get copies of audio tapes made by Judge Chillingworth in the weeks and months leading up to his disappearance. And Kathy, they were also able to get newsreel footage that was shot the day that the Chillingworths disappeared. So they knew that the Chillingworths had disappeared sometime before Frank Ebersol, the contractor, came over at 8 o'clock that morning. And so they then had newsreel footage of the police trampling the crime scene later that morning and that afternoon. So it was fascinating, the stories they could tell. So actually, because of their connection with the Chillingworths and the crime that happened so long ago, whenever there was kind of a different news account version versus the podcast,
right,
we deferred to the podcast. There were two things that stood out in my mind from the evidence that the two guys were given for their podcast. One of them is there was newsreel footage that actually showed the law enforcement officers trampling all over. And they said when you looked at the sand in the footage, there was no distinguishable footprint at all. And then there was a photograph that showed one of the officers kicking back at the dining room table, drinking an RC Cola.
An RC Cola?
I found out what that stood for. It's Royal Crown Cola.
Oh, interesting.
So anyways,
I never knew that.
So I'm not sure you're supposed to do that at crime scenes.
Yeah, he was chill.
Yeah, totally. But again, as we've seen through all of our hundreds of episodes, evidence preservation and crime scene preservation was different back then.
It was totally different.
Like there wasn't that same standard because they didn't have the same abilities to test things.
No, and they invited news media into crime scenes.
Right. And drank RC Cola.
Right. So by the end of the week, there were no sightings of Curtis and Marjorie Chillingworth and no new evidence or even any leads. And so because this was so out of character for them to be gone, law enforcement assumed that they'd been abducted and possibly killed. They were waiting for the ransom. It didn't happen. But the investigation continued, and detectives then, they're like, okay, Judge Chillingworth, maybe he pissed some people off while he was on the bench. So they start looking at people who may have some type of vendetta against him. And so, Kath, one of the things that came out was that Judge Chillingworth had a reputation for favoring women in divorce cases. And of course, this infuriated a lot of husbands because, of course, the division of assets, blah, 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 blah. But Judge Chillingworth was known for being very open-minded when it came to what the wives would get in the divorce. He was also known for being very fair with minorities, which wasn't always a thing back then. So he gained a reputation among the criminal population because he gave lengthy sentences and even death sentences to criminals who came before him. So he was viewed as very, very ethical. So the detective started looking into cases for possible motives to kill the judge. And I remember one that I read about. It was a man who had been convicted of killing 3 women with a machete. And he didn't get the death penalty. Instead, the judge ordered him to life in prison. And I feel like there was a mental health issue attributed to that, but I just can't be positive. Anyway, life wasn't life. Life allowed this guy to be eligible for parole in like 10 years or something ridiculous. So detectives start looking at this guy and they're thinking, you know what? By this time, he'd be eligible parole. Is he out? Anyway, that wound up at a dead end. And so there were other things going on in Palm Beach at the time, like the numbers racket was a big thing, which meant the mafia was a big thing. So could this been a mafia hit kind of thing?
Really quickly, though, the numbers racket, it turns out, because I had to look this up, so just in case others don't know, it's an illegal street lottery where bettors will bet small amounts on a daily 3-digit number. I don't know who comes up with that number. I don't know where it's posted or said or whatnot. But basically, it was like before the lottery was a thing or legal. It was like the poor man's version of the lottery.
Totally.
And the reason I say poor man's is because it usually hit very poor neighborhoods.
Right. Everybody was hoping to strike it rich. Yeah, I don't know. How do they verify that daily 3-digit number? Who knows?
I had no idea.
But anyway, it was a big thing because you got lots of people paying a little bit of money and it was lucrative.
And it was all cash.
Right. Anyway, so that did not lead detectives to any leads in the case. And they also looked into the fact that aside from gambling, moonshine was really pervasive. And so could it have been somebody's family who got hooked up for moonshine and now they're pissed off and whatever? So there were a lot of things detectives were looking at in West Palm Beach in the 1950s, along with organized crime and corruption, moonshine, whatnot. So detectives were never able to make any connections to the Chillingworth disappearance. And 2 years after Curtis and Marjorie went missing, they were declared legally dead. It would be another 3 years before the case was back on detectives' radar. So according to a Time magazine article, on the night of November 3rd, 1958, the body of a small-time bootlegger, a 21-year-old named Lou Harvey, was fished out of a canal near Palm Beach. Now, everybody knew it was murder because his body was weighted down with chains and he had a bullet hole in his head. Detectives didn't have any real clues to go on, and then one day, the bootlegger's widow walks into the police station and says, I just had a recollection. The night I last saw my husband, he was with a guy and I couldn't remember his name, but now I do. It was John Lynch. And so detectives were like, whoa, we know that name. It's an alias for a guy named Floyd Holtzapfel. So the police realized that 36-year-old Floyd Holtzapfel, who bore the alias John Lynch, because back in the 1950s, you could be frickin' anonymous as you wanted.
Ah, the good old days.
The good old days. Anyway, so Floyd was handsome. He was a paratrooper in World War II. He was wounded in action. He was a former member of the Oklahoma City Police Department. He was an assistant scoutmaster, and he had been arrested for attempted murder 2 years before the bootlegger was fished out of the canal. So, knowing that Floyd had been arrested for attempted murder, of course, took the sheen off his lovely career, and detectives now wondered, could this have been the guy that killed bootlegger Lou Harvey? The detectives also knew that in the attempted murder case for which Floyd was arrested, he had a partner in crime who was a member of the legal profession, and his name was Joseph Peel.
So, Kathy, detectives looked into Joseph Peel, and they realized that he had actually served on the bench with Judge Chillingworth. But 3 years before the judge went missing, Peel had actually stepped down from the circuit court because he'd been elected as city magistrate. And Kath, the city magistrate, it's similar to a judge, but different in a number of ways. One of which was it was a part-time job, so he was allowed to go back to his legal career and start practicing as an attorney. But also, instead of ruling over courts, the magistrate presided over lower-level legal matters that included things like issuing search warrants. So, of course, Kath, the detectives were interested that Magistrate Peel had actually worked with Judge Chillingworth, so they decided to look into their relationship between the magistrate and the judge. And what they discovered, Kath, is that when they were both judges for the circuit court, they didn't really have a lot of interaction. Their cases didn't overlap, anything like that. And remember, as magistrate, he now was a practicing attorney as well, since magistrate was a part-time job. So he did have some cases before Judge Chillingworth in his court. So in his capacity as an attorney, the detectives found out that Magistrate Peel and Judge Chillingworth actually butted heads. And it turned out that Peel was before Judge Chillingworth for a divorce case, but he was representing both the husband and the wife.
Ruh-roh.
Yeah, this was unethical, but both parties had agreed to it apparently. But after the wife was granted an equal share of their assets, the husband filed a complaint and said, "Nay, nay, fair maiden." Are regular people allowed to say that? I'm not sure.
They are.
Okay, good. But, nay, nay, fair maiden, you just screwed me. You were supposed to get me more money than my wife.
Right.
So it was actually Judge Chillingworth who was assigned to preside over this malpractice case.
Because, of course, the husband later sued Peel.
And remember, Judge Chillingworth was known to be highly ethical, stickler for the law. And I actually read, Kathy, that he had long been regarded as the conscience of the Palm Beach County judiciary.
I think Judge Julianne, our friend, is the conscience of the Orange County judiciary.
I would agree with that 100%. I would be in her courtroom any day, except for she wouldn't cut me a break if I was guilty. So I'm not sure.
I take it back.
But anyway, during the course of this malpractice case, because Peel was found liable, he thought that the judge was going to disbar him and was shocked when instead Judge Chillingworth suspended him from practicing law for just 2 months. And then, Kath, in a stern voice, the judge said that if Magistrate Peel appeared in his courtroom again for another ethical violation, he would be disbarred. 2 years later, that's exactly what happened. While the case of the dead bootlegger, Lou Harvey, who was found weighted down with a bullet in his head in the canal, it went cold pretty quickly. But 4 years later, the Chillingworth case picked up momentum. So, Kath, here's what happened. Floyd Holtzapfel, who we talked about being the last person seen with dead bootlegger Lou Harvey, remember the wife had gone to the police, he apparently got a little tipsy, was bragging to a friend that he knew all about who killed the Chillingworths. And that friend went straight to a cop. So the friend talks to the cop and the cop is like, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to get Floyd to show up at a motel room. We are going to get him drunk enough that he's going to spill all the secrets. And so that's what they did. They got Floyd into a hotel room. They got him drunk. He starts talking about everything that happened to the Chillingworths. This is his version of events. But little did Floyd know, there was an officer from the Florida Sheriff's Bureau in the room next door, and he recorded everything. According to Floyd, here's what happened to Judge Curtis Chillingworth and his wife, Marjorie. It turned out that Magistrate Joseph Peel was behind the entire thing. He hired Floyd and another man named Bobby Lincoln to kill the Chillingworths for $2,500. This is the equivalent of an average annual salary back in the day. Now, remember when we said that Judge Chillingworth warned Magistrate Peel that if he showed up in his court again on an ethical violation, he'd be disbarred? Well, Joe couldn't help himself, and he committed malpractice again. And Kath, this time, he apparently told a female client that, yep, your divorce has been finalized. I've filed all the paperwork. You're a free woman now. Toddle on off and have yourself some fun. I'm paraphrasing. But Kath, she remarried and had a child, just like the magistrate told her to do, but he never filed the paperwork. So technically, she was a bigamist, and she filed a complaint. So Magistrate Peel now knows he's going to go back to the circuit court, and he's like, okay,
I can't face Chillingworth.
Exactly. I'm going to hope, I'm going to pray, I'm going to smudge the rooms, I'm going to light sage. And it didn't work. It ended up being scheduled for Judge Chillingworth's court. Kath, the day the Chillingworths died was the day Magistrate Peel was due in his courtroom.
And the reason that Magistrate Peel was so desperate not to be disbarred is because he was taking bribes. It turns out that Peel was involved in the local numbers racket as well as the moonshine rackets. And as a magistrate, he had access to all the police warrants. He was the one who signed off on them. So he knew exactly who was under the police radar.
And when.
Right, exactly. So in exchange for a cash payment, he would tip off the local operators before the raid could happen. Now, as you can imagine, this is very lucrative to the criminals. You're saving my moonshine or my numbers game or my drugs or whatever the heck.
Or keeping people out of prison and I need them to do the work for me.
That is correct. So a really valuable asset for a crook. So his annual salary as a magistrate was about $3,000 a year. Now, mind you, homes were 10 grand back then, but with the bribes, it tripled his salary. And so if he were disbarred, in addition to no longer making any money as an attorney, he would lose his position as a magistrate and he wouldn't be rolling in the cash.
Yeah, you don't sign the warrants. You can't tell them when something's going to happen.
Exactly. So as you can imagine, Magistrate Peel had motive to want Judge Chillingworth dead. And his poor wife was simply a victim of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. So Floyd, in this recording that he made when he was drunk, and unbeknownst to him was recorded by law enforcement, told the story of the Chillingworth murders. He said that he was put up to it by Magistrate Peel, and he and his buddy Bobby Lincoln went to the judge's house, the beach house, after midnight. The two men landed a boat on the sand, and they were just going to pretend that they were boaters and their engine had broken down, and can you please help us? So Floyd knocked on the Chillingworth's door while Bobby Lincoln hid in the bushes. So the judge answers the door in his pajamas, and Bobby rushes him. So Floyd pulls a gun, and he asks the judge, is anyone else in the house? And the judge said, yes, my wife is. So Floyd orders Judge Chillingworth to call his wife and ask her to come to the back door, which she does. And once poor Marjorie walks in the room, the couple's hands were taped and they were led out of the house. So as the Chillingworths were walking down the stairs to the beach, Marjorie screamed. Then Floyd pistol whipped her to get her to stop, and that's why the police found a trail of blood leading to the water. So, not realizing this was a murder for hire scenario, Judge Chillingworth offered Floyd and his buddy $200,000 to let them go.
That's $2.5 million.
I know, crazy, but it didn't work. Anyway, once on the boat, they rowed several miles out to sea.
Kath, in the podcast, they said they rode, and everything else I read said that as well, because basically the houses, I mean, they weren't that far apart, and they didn't want to have a motor starting up. That would have woken up the neighbors.
Got it. So once out to sea, the two men put chains and 30-pound weights around the Chillingworths.
It was around their wrists, so their hands were chained in front of them with the weights, and around their feet.
I can't imagine how terrifying. The last words of the Chillingworths showed their devotion to each other. Now, mind you, they had been married 35 years. Curtis told Marjorie, honey, remember I love you. And she replied, I love you too. Then, this makes me sick. According to the recording, Bobby then asked Floyd who was going first, and Floyd responded, ladies first, and then pushed Marjorie overboard. I cannot imagine.
I can't imagine her husband and what he was going through watching that.
I can't imagine. But here's what happens. Curtis, who had managed to free his feet, jumped into the water after his wife. Of course, I'm sure trying to save her. So remember, he was former Navy, and I'm sure he was a strong swimmer and probably thought he could survive and save her. But he surfaced for air, and Floyd grabbed him, dragged him back onto the boat, wound a rope with an anchor around his neck, and tossed him back into the water.
And Kathy, that was one of the differences that I had read. Some of the articles said that Floyd bashed Curtis in the head with the butt of a shotgun, but the podcast said that it was just the anchor. That's obviously in quotes. Either way, it's horrific.
It's horrific, and their bodies were never found. It took detectives 5 years from the murders of the Chillingworths to the arrest of Floyd and Magistrate Joe Peel. And ironically, and here's the freaking crazy irony, within the time from the murder to the arrest, Magistrate Peel was actually forced to give up his law license and resign as magistrate, meaning he lost the ability to accept bribes from criminals.
And Kathy, the reason that Joe Peel lost his license was because he was arrested along with Floyd for attempting to kill Joe Peel's law partner. Apparently, Peel had a need for money, and he forged signatures on a $100,000 life insurance policy for his law partner. Peele paid Floyd and another man to beat the law partner to death. And Kath, it seemed it didn't matter how much they beat this man, but he did not die. So once he was recovered and out of the hospital, he went to the police and told them what had happened. And so Joe Peele and Floyd were arrested and charged with attempted murder. The case never went to trial because Joe Peele agreed to give up his law license in exchange for dismissing the case. So this just happened a year after the Chillingworths disappeared. And of course, as we said, if he didn't have a law license, he couldn't be a magistrate.
If he wasn't a magistrate, he couldn't take bribes.
Exactly. So everything went to crap.
Good.
And Kathy, while it was suspected that Floyd Holtzapfel was responsible for the murder of bootlegger Lou Harvey, he was never arrested for it. But Floyd was arrested on October 1st, 1960 for the murders of Curtis and Marjorie Chillingworth. Now, Kath, once he was put in jail, he slashed his wrists and actually nearly died in a cell. But he survived, and 2.5 months later, he pleaded guilty to the Chillingworth murders. Now, despite his cooperation with police, and he went in and told them exactly what happened, even though it was all recorded anyway, he was still, being helpful.
He told them while he was sober.
Exactly. But he was still sent to death row. However, his death sentence was commuted 6 years later, and he died in prison in 1996 at the age of 72 after having served 36 years. Former magistrate Joe Peele was also arrested, but Kath, he jumped bail and dipped.
This man's got some nads.
Well, he thinks he's above the law. But following a nationwide manhunt, the police captured him in a Chattanooga hotel room 4 months later and brought him back to trial.
I wonder if the Chattanooga hotel room was near Jennifer's mainline tattoo place.
I believe it probably was. Trial began for former magistrate Joe Peele in March 1961, and Kath, he was charged with being an accessory before the fact, and the state requested the death penalty. And Kath, I thought you would love this. The state's attorney told the jury, the ghost of Judge Chillingworth will not rest until his killers are shoveling coal in the fires of hell damnation.
I really do like that.
I think it's probably better with a deeper voice and a Southern accent.
I like the drama of it.
Yeah.
I don't like the concept, but I like the drama.
Exactly. No, he's painting a picture. Despite denying having anything to do with the murders, Peele was found guilty, but instead of the death penalty, the jury recommended 2 life sentences. However, Kath, he was granted compassionate release in 1982, and this is after serving 21 years because he was seriously ill with cancer. 9 days after he was released from prison, he died at the age of 57. Now, Floyd's partner in crime, Bobby Lincoln, this was the other man with Floyd who kidnapped the Chillingworths and took them out on the boat. He was granted immunity from prosecution in return for testifying against former magistrate Joe Peele, and after trial, he moved to Chicago, where he lived until his death in 2004. Now, this is really sad, Kath. After Judge Chillingworth's murder, relatives found a draft of a letter he wrote that was addressed to then Florida Governor Leroy Collins. The judge was announcing his intention to retire from the bench on June 16th, 1955. This was the day after he and his wife were kidnapped and killed. But the letter had never been sent.
Actually, that would have been the first day of his retirement when his daughters and their families came to visit.
You're exactly right.
I wonder if it was going to be a surprise.
Probably. And they had a world cruise coming up.
Exactly.
So, Kath, the bodies were never found, as you said earlier, but there is an empty grave at Woodlawn Cemetery that memorializes Curtis and Marjorie Chillingworth. The 3 Chillingworth daughters, Neva, Anne, and Marie, along with Marie's husband, Bill, honored their parents by endowing the Chillingworth Memorial Scholarship Fund at Florida State University. This was the alma mater of the 3 girls. And Kath, I checked. It is still available as a scholarship, and it primarily supports any students who are enrolling in the College of Education. And then just finally, their memory is still in West Palm Beach because Chillingworth Drive, which is north of Okeechobee Boulevard, my now favorite boulevard, also runs past a West Palm Beach park that is named after the couple.